Everybody, so we can get going. At the extreme on your left, at the end of the table, is Katherine Perriel. Did I say it right this time? Okay, very good. Who will act as our moderator, and she is an organizer with the ACLU. She has been empowering others and creating change from very early in life. After pursuing a degree and working in case management, a desire to create change at a macro level was reignited in her. Her passion for empowerment and creating change alongside her background in social services helped her to transition into becoming an organizer for the ACLU. While an organizer at ACLU of Florida, she has focused on providing Floridians with education, mobilizing people, and building power to achieve a fair and just Florida, where all people are free, equal under the law, and live with dignity. And we could only hope that that will actually come to fruition. Right. The next, I'm going to introduce them in order, although they're not really sitting that way, but it's okay. The next person on our panel is David Williamson, who can, wave at everybody there. David Williamson co-founded the Central Florida Free Thought Community, an organization of atheists and humanists fighting for the separation between religion and government, and building a secular community in Greater Orlando. David serves locally on the Central Florida Commission on Religious Freedom and the Board of Directors of the Interfaith Council of Central Florida. He is coordinator of the biennial conference, Free Flow, on the advisory board of the Center for Free Thought Equality, and is Florida's state representative for the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Next, that will be speaking in order of the ideas in the First Amendment, will be Bobby Block on the black shirt. Yeah, Bobby has had a 4-decade career in journalism, including contributing to the Tribune Company, Reuters, and the Wall Street Journal's coverage of 9/11, which earned a Pulitzer Prize for breaking news in 2002. He's co-authored a book about Hurricane Katrina, which was a 2006 Washington Post Book of the Year. He has reported around the globe on various conflicts. As a firm believer in government transparency, Mr. Block views America's constitutional rights of free speech to be at the heart of all our freedoms. And getting local here, because he is the executive director of the First Amendment Foundation here in Florida, he has said public records and sunshine laws are routinely disregarded across Florida with seemingly no fear of reprisals. This cannot be allowed to stand for the sake of our democracy. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Kimberly Voss, who is a tenured professor of journalism at UCF. Go Knights! All right. The author of 3 books and co-author of a 4th. She has been a featured speaker for multiple journalism organizations. She has published more than 30 articles about women and journalism history, and her research has been quoted on NPR, the BBC, the Columbia Journalism Review, Huffington Post, and numerous newspapers across the country. So now, if we would all give a warm round of applause for our and David will get us started. So it doesn't matter, either one. Okay. And then...
Thanks, Valerie, and thanks to each of you for being here tonight and for supporting the League and for preserving the shared civic values that we need to carry on. But also to bring others into the conversation with you. So how many people were brought here tonight and not on the League email list? Look at that. All right. So I can get behind that proselytizing. When our constitutional framers forged the new national charter, they got some things right. They got a lot of things wrong. Granted, it's likely because there were no women in the room. But we don't hear people describe the United States as a male nation. Mistakes were made because they weren't all white, or they were all white, But we don't hear, fortunately, very often anymore that the United States is a white nation. But you know what we do hear very often? You know, say it with me. The framers codified misogyny and xenophobia, so if they wanted us to be a Christian nation, they sure missed the best opportunity they had. In fact, our godless Constitution mentions religion only once in Article 6, as it forbids religious tests for public office. The founders were religious, but they put their country before their religion. I think we need more of our leaders to do that today. In the original unamended Constitution, or rather in the First Amendment in 1791, they would guarantee both freedom from and of religion, notably in that order. The Establishment Clause is a shield protecting us from government-imposed religion. Without freedom from religion from the government, we have no option for our own religion. So that's why it matters. The Establishment Clause doesn't just prevent the naming of an official religion, it prevents authorities at all levels, local, state, federal, from favoring any particular faith and compelling religious beliefs or practices. And while case specifics can influence outcomes, courts have generally interpreted the Establishment Clause to require government impartiality in religious matters. As for the Free Exercise Clause, it ensures we can hold theistic and other beliefs, worship, and even practice religion according to our own conscience. This clause is especially important to minority religions since it prevents the government from punishing or restricting religious expression simply because it's unpopular or unconventional. In fact, the United States has been unique in fostering an extraordinary diversity of religions and denominations, primarily because of the foresight of our religious constitutional framers. We literally invented the separation of church and state here, and it's led to a vibrant religious marketplace. Nowhere else in the world does it exist as it has here for so long, where older traditions coexist alongside newer traditions that are American-made. Movements like Mormonism, Scientology, Christian Science, and many Protestant denominations, including some of you probably in this room as well. Lately, though, the Free Exercise Clause is seen by some not as a shield, but as a sword used to discriminate against religious minorities and marginalized communities. Significant shifts in the courts, particularly at the federal level, where most religious freedom cases are filed, have led to more conservative rulings. And the difference between the Free Exercise and Establishment Clauses is most obvious when they are taken separately, but that rarely happens. And I'll tell you why. The government is made up of people. Elected officials, employees, and even volunteers. People are free to pray, attend religious worship services, express their faith in many ways, but people in government, when acting in their official capacity, must not use the power of government to endorse, impose, or favor their religion. So they face a unique challenge because they are both individuals and state actors. And they usually get it wrong because they aren't taught how to get it right. They have to move between those two roles simultaneously throughout their day, throughout their lives, even off the clock, so to speak. Most of us don't lose our free exercise rights by simply going to work, but those in government have a special obligation to work within limitations imposed by the Establishment Clause. For example, a city supervisor can't lead a prayer of their team without violating the Establishment Clause rights of employees. A school volunteer cannot invite a student under their care to their church. And a mayor or governor can attend religious events but should not use taxpayer funds to promote them. I had to point this out just a few months ago when the National Day of Prayer invite hit my inbox as a local member of clergy from one of the mayors. Let's circle back to that myth about U.S. being a Christian nation. And as we talk about all the freedoms that are at risk this evening, consider the overlap with things like Project 2025 and the January 6th Capitol attack. Things that are at risk from Christian nationalists and their allies include the right to abortion, gay marriage and transgender equality, censorship of everything from late-night talk show hosts to school books, the rights of religious minorities, and things so fundamental to our democracy as voting rights. There's virtually no space between Christian nationalism and fascism on these issues. According to friend, author, attorney, and activist Andrew Seidel, Christian nationalists rewrite our history and claim to be the true heirs of the American experiment to justify a hateful, exclusionary movement that is seeking to privilege conservative Christians over every other American. This urgent existential threat to our democracy is at its core a cultural problem, not a religious one. Powerful people have always found tools to wield as weapons to maintain their power and privilege. Christian nationalists are doing the same thing here that others have done in Hindu, Muslim, and Buddhist majority countries. They grab the majority religion and make it their weapon of choice. Recall that women's suffrage and civil rights movements needed white men to join that fight. Christian nationalism will require conservative Christian leaders to speak out against it. Fortunately, many Christians are already realizing that it's not only a threat to our shared democracy, but to their sacred tradition as well. So to protect real religious freedom from Christian nationalism, we need to know what the threat is, what it isn't, and to be able to describe it clearly to others. So if you're looking for action items, this is it. Know what Christian nationalism is, how to describe it to others, and what it isn't. The threat is not religion. We need to use our own voices, our written words, and we need to be louder by being with allies in these spaces. Now is not the time to be alone. Whether you're up late at night on the computer or out on the street protesting, don't be alone. We need to vote for and support pro-separation candidates and against Christian nationalists. Complacency is not an option, or the myth of Christian nationalism will become a reality.
No moderation?
She wants to jump in.
Not yet. Okay. Hi, I'm Bobby Block. I'm the Executive Director of the First Amendment Foundation. And for the record, I got off of social media about 10 years ago. And it was long before it got ugly. I just got tired of looking at what people were going to have for lunch or dinner all day. And later on, as things started developing, I started seeing when I would foray in there into Facebook or onto the other platforms, a political ugliness that was starting to come out. And I found it a little bit irritating because there were people that I knew and had social interactions with, and I didn't want to know what their politics were, and all of a sudden it's being forced upon me. So my instinct was to kind of move away from it. But I recognize it from a background both in journalism, marketing, everything else, the importance that social media had. I just didn't like engaging in it because my opinion was that it was starting to tribalize minds, and it was people who only wanted to find other people that validated their opinions and views. And lo and behold, we've come to a point. We're a nonprofit. We defend free expression, and we also defend your constitutional right to open government and access to government information, or a better way to say it, against government secrecy in the state of Florida. So my board was saying I've got to get over my distaste of social media, and I've got to get out there, and I've got to start making TikTok videos. And I was thinking, I'm probably a little gray for that, but I could try it, and I'm a fervent believer in free expression, and I'm also under the impression, I'll get to this further down the line, that people's understanding of what the First Amendment is completely way off base. And a lot of people who you think should know it, it turns out they really don't. So we put out some interesting little short videos talking about hey, we're the First Amendment Foundation, freedom of expression. I quoted one of my favorite sayings, which actually comes from FIRE, which is the Foundation for the Individual Rights of Expression, whose statement says it all to me: free speech makes free people. And I said something like this. And you would have you could be forgiven for thinking that I said, conservatives are animals, or liberals are dogs, or something like this. Everybody went nuts. And that level of intolerance and that level of people being locked into their viewpoints reminded me of a story of a few years ago. I think it was in 2017, Stanford University psychology department did an experiment where the first semester of the course, they taught literally bullshit to their students. And the first day of the second semester, they said, ha 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 ha, we taught you bullshit the first semester. Now we're going to teach you the truth, and we're going to refund your money. And what they found, which was the experiment, was students refuse to let go of ideas that they learned in the first semester, even though they were told it was wrong. So there's something psychological about us that we get locked into viewpoints. And I see that most strongly now in an area that I never ever thought would be a lightning rod, which is our ability to speak freely. If you ask anyone if they support free speech, everyone says yes. But their support for free speech is rooted not in a desire to deepen public debate and to be tolerant of views and to learn things, but it's to lecture and berate. And it comes from two things that I keep seeing. It comes from fear, which I think is the political word. Remember, Stephen Colbert found the word truthiness. You know, he coined that term, and that captured the essence of the Bush years. Well, fear is what we're working with now. Politicians are afraid of each other. They're afraid of their constituents. They're afraid of the other people's constituents. It's a lot of fear-based. And combined with that fear is selfishness. So what you have when it comes to all issues of free speech is, I want to defend my free speech. Yours, not so much. And as a result, we are now looking at a Grand Canyon that sits between people about what they view as free speech and what free speech actually is. And the fact of the matter is, so I get questions all the time, particularly over the last week, can people be fired for what they put on their social media posts?
Sure.
And the answer, of course, is it depends. Your company, if you work for a private company or an institution, that organization has a right to its own free speech. And that free speech may be that they don't want you talking about certain topics. They don't want you delving into partisan politics. They don't want you doing that because they have their bottom line and their message and other things to think about. So courts have always found that if you open your mouth and your company doesn't like what you said and fires you, your First Amendment rights haven't been violated. Precisely because you don't have to work at that job. The First Amendment doesn't protect your right to employment. It protects your right of speech, primarily from government retaliation. That's the key word. The key word is you should feel free to speak without being afraid that the government is going to punish you for your viewpoint or perspective. Which is exactly what we saw last week when Brendan Carr, the head of the FCC, made some clear threats to the affiliates and to ABC about that we could do this the easy way or the hard way in terms of canceling licenses and putting them through hell if they didn't do something about Jimmy Fallon. Jimmy Kimmel. That's another Jimmy. They're all the same. In any case, the fact of the matter is the problem is, and there's a word for it, it's called jawboning. It's actually a legal term, which is probably one of the more fun legal terms I've come across. But jawboning means that you can't use the power of the government to try to retaliate against another individual by threatening someone else. Effectively, you can't use the government to try to get someone else to do what you can't do yourself. And that was a crossed line. Now that's a lot different from people going out and saying things on social media about holding certain opinions. And we've seen this, and I want to use this to segue into what this fear, this selfishness, this lack of understanding that we have seen starting to take place all over has been fed by, unfortunately, all political sides. Everyone's played the game of cancel culture. Conservatives now want to call it consequence culture because they think that validates it better. But it effectively is the same thing. It's seeking to silence voices that you don't like. Now, the problem with this is, when you do that, is it illegal? Usually not. In the case when the government gets involved, yes. but usually not. Teachers and public servants occupy a slightly different space. Public schools are considered limited public fora. There's generally some kinds of rules, but these guys have gone way beyond that. And what we now see happening is we have this idea where everyone wants to be a victim. Everyone wants to claim that their position, that they've been victimized, their views have been victimized, and therefore that entitles that to do other. And you see this spiral going on of intolerance. So the problem with the cancel culture is, on one hand, what it really does is it kills exactly what the First Amendment is supposed to foster, and that is vigorous public debate. It also ends up not only building walls between people, but it cycles. You could look at Charlie Kirk's assassination as the ultimate in cancel culture. It was an attempt to silence a voice permanently. Now, the view is, for a lot of people that didn't like Charlie Kirk, and I'm not endorsing Kirk's views, and I'm not condemning them either. He had a right to express them. The point is, speech you don't like, which you often hear people labeling as hate speech, is almost always protected speech. And the Supreme Court has always come to this conclusion, that for the sake of vigorous debate, public debate is often ugly. And what we need to do when we see speech we don't like is we need to counter it with speech that we do. And instead, what we find going on right now is, rather than countering speech, we want to silence it. And this is behind everything. The government, the current regime, the current administration is obviously stoking this. The current administration is coming out with all kinds of crazy ideas that are furthering the notion that if you are speaking against a position that they hold, or in this particular case, conservative positions, that's hate speech and should be punished. We have a case right now where in Alachua County, a school board member made a post after the memorial for Charlie Kirk, in which he said she was very upset with the aggrandizement of the reputation of this uneducated white boy. She right now is going, there's pressure on her that they're going to try to fire her, which is, to me, absolutely obscene, because she's not an employee, she's a politician. And if you're going to use the power of the government to enforce a unified view on politicians, we're all lost. So the problem that, there's another issue that's also running. There's so much to talk about that it's difficult to shrink it down to an essence and do it in a way that sticks with you and is entertaining. But the fact of the matter is that we need to go back, and we need to, I have friends of mine, very progressive, and I remember, this is years ago, when we talked about the statement, sticks and stones may break my bones. And my friend got very upset. Words are just as hurtful, and they could hurt more than sticks and stones. And while I understood what she said, because words are powerful and can leave a mark, most people who say this have never been hit with sticks and stones. And while I do believe words are damaging, we also have the ability to understand where people are coming from. FIRE, which I mentioned earlier, was originally founded and funded by the Koch brothers as an attempt to fight for to defend conservative speech on campuses. And being good First Amendment lawyers, they quickly recognized that they can't defend conservative speech without defending progressive speech. And you can't fight for progressive speech unless you defend conservative speech. So they changed, they expanded their funding, and then a few years ago they announced that they were going to move off of campuses and move everywhere. And they are some of the most important litigators, along with the ACLU, for First Amendment rights. And in this process, I had lost my train of thought. I have to get it back. So when fire emerged and came onto the scene and decided they were going to defend everyone, they had a gala in New York. And the guest speaker was interesting, was Killer Mike, who is a rap star. And Killer Mike said he learned about his love, and he reminded me of a few things. It was rather brilliant. He said, a lot of people think the First Amendment is about speaking, but it's about just as much hearing. And that means hearing things you may not want to hear, but it's important that you have the ability to hear them. And he remembers being taken by his grandfather as a little boy, and his grandfather was born into slavery. And they grew up, I think, in Mississippi, but it was somewhere in the Deep South. And the grandfather took his son to a little city council meeting. And before he walked in, he said to the young boy, he said, you know what I love about the First Amendment? Within 5 minutes of us walking into the room, we're going to know exactly who our enemies are. And if you think about it, the ability for people to define themselves without wanting to hide who they are, such as white Christian nationalism. The ability of people to define who they are through their own speech, which might be horrific to listen to, is really important for us to know. And if we give up, if we want to silence voices, we're silencing our ability to know those things. There's a whole other issue I'd love to get into, but we don't have time at this stage, but I'm happy to talk to you, and that is about growing government secrecy, which I think goes hand in hand with limiting our ability to speak. But the thing is, the best thing that I recommend when it comes to calls of action is resist the desire to throw stones and cancel people whose speech you don't like. Remember, speech that you don't like, chances are it's better to have it out there than not. And the other thing is, groups like ours often end up defending speech that none of us can endorse, precisely because if we don't defend that kind of speech, we can't defend the speech that is good. So there's a resiliency and a tolerance as a society that we need to rediscover. And I'm afraid that until we discover that again, and the last thing I want to say before I hand off is, I've been doing a lot of interviews lately, and people are asking me about some of the messages that anti-Charlie Crist people say. And I am as close to an absolutist when it comes to the First Amendment as you can find, and I don't want to chill speech. But I want to say that I don't think we have to give up our humanity to protect our free speech. And I don't want to compare Charlie Kirk's death to 9/11, but if you remember, after 9/11, there was a long debate that a lot of satirists and comedians had about when it was safe to talk about this again. When was there a time of passing of mourning? And it shows how much we've changed since then. That when Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked, the first thing people did was make fun of Nancy Pelosi and the husband, and there were no calls at that particular time that for silencing, people who are defending Charlie Kirk never bring that up. And at the same time, it's very easy to forget that while we may not like his message, one thing about Charlie that I did respect was he was a tireless supporter of the First Amendment. And he did encourage people to debate him. He didn't believe in silencing other voices. And while a lot of people hated his message, a lot of people loved his message. And while we may not agree with them, the thing to always remember is he was a young father and a husband, and somebody lost that. And just because we can say something doesn't necessarily mean we should. And we have to think carefully that even if your First Amendment rights aren't violated, you could say something online and still be trolled pretty badly. So you have to recognize that your words have consequences, whether or not they're what you intend. So by all means engage, don't stop engaging, but we need to stop this cycle of attempting to cancel and silence, and we have to be a little bit, in my opinion, we've lost our empathy somewhere along the way, and we need to get that back as well as asserting our free speech. So thank you.
Sarah? Hi. respect everything that's been said. And before I get into my specific talks, I've been a professor at UCF since 2008, and I've been a professor overall for 35 years. The kids are okay. If you want to feel good about stuff, they're doing great. And I think that's important to remember, because it's easy to get kind of pulled down by things. And I've taught at a lot of places, and really they care, they're interested. They think about the First Amendment and what that means and what they can do. And I've never been more happy hearing students talk about things they don't agree with and said, okay, let's put together a panel on campus. The answer to speech you don't like is more speech. And they get it. Like, you don't have to lecture. The concept of that makes sense to them. But I'll go back for a second to what I was going to say to begin with. So I'm here to talk about freedom of the press as part of the First Amendment, which in many ways, like freedom of speech is complicated, right? We don't think about it until someone tries to silence us, or we don't like what someone's saying. Otherwise, we're all fine about freedom of the press, right? Freedom of speech, until somehow we're offended by these things. That's when it suddenly matters, right? I want to start out by talking about a journalist by the name of Vera Glasser. She was from a wire service out of St. Louis. She worked in D.C. In 1969, she was in the third row when President Nixon had the second televised press conference ever. And that's a big deal, because if you were fourth or beyond, you didn't get a question. If you think about the rooms and what it looks like, you have to be up front. And so she had a large list of questions, and she felt that all the other reporters were doing softball questions because it was on TV. It had been done before, right? So they were letting Nixon off kind of easy. And she went through her list, and he got to her, and she said, are you ever going to have women in your cabinet? All the men in the room laughed. And this was on TV, like, it's not, you know what I mean? It's not rumor, it's not speculation. The men literally laughed at her question, and so did Nixon. And as she said, yes, later, he didn't realize he was on TV, but he was laughing at her. And so then, it led to this moment where her question as a reporter became national news. Just that question. And by the way, a woman did finally end up in the cabinet. I'm not saying it's just because of her, but it became a conversation. And that's how it's supposed to work. She asked a question that everyone found uncomfortable. And action took place from that. All these things that matter are because we add more conversation. And I'm not to say that the First Amendment and the press always works perfectly. I'm also a journalist and historian. That's actually kind of my main thing. Up until the early 1970s, if you went to get a job, you would look in the newspaper, right? Help wanted ads. They were listed by gender. They were listed by gender. So if there's any question about where you should be in your career, it was in the newspaper. If you were going to be a secretary, a clerk, something lower level, it was there. That's where. And of course, you could apply for a job that said men, but you've already been told that you're probably not going to get it, because otherwise it wouldn't be in that category. It was newspapers that took that to the Supreme Court to try to defend themselves under the First Amendment. They should be able to discriminate if they want to. They didn't say that exactly, but that was the point. So it's not that the press has always been this amazing champion for women, for people of color, for all sorts of different things. It's complicated. But to go back to what I was saying earlier, these college students are amazing. They listen, they pay attention, they want to know how to push back at things, and they understand that being offended is not the end game. That being offended means add more speech to that. And every campus I've ever been on, I've been amazed by it. Now, mind you, I've mostly taught at public universities, and so that's inherently different. But not even public universities treat free speech correctly. I've taught on campuses where every campus is supposed to have a free speech zone. And in some places, they put it far, far away. So there's no real sense of that. Whereas at UCF, it's between the administrative building and the student union. And they will fight and argue, and it is the best thing ever. Because they get the point of that, right? Keep talking, explain why this doesn't make sense to you. And I don't know, I mean, if I had to guess, I don't think anyone's opinion has been changed. But they're out there and they're talking and they're contributing about what the First Amendment is. And part of the challenge, I think, at times, is that we don't do a great job in civics in high school. Because a number of times I've had to explain how the federal government works to juniors in college. It's a little concerning, you know, that they don't understand that the First Amendment is about the government coming after your free speech. There used to be a show called Duck Dynasty. And I think actually the guy that I'm talking about has died, so, you know, sorry to him and his family. But I remember a lot of students at the time saying, oh my gosh, when he got censored, that was his First Amendment rights. And every semester I used to begin by going, you do not have a First Amendment right to a basic cable show. You don't. It's about the government. But it became abundantly clear that the understanding of what the First Amendment is not being taught overall. And I find that year after year, in fact, it's probably getting a little worse every year, about understanding what the First Amendment means. And I teach one semester, it's about 200 some students, mostly mass comm. And the other semester I teach honor students, which is about 15, not mass comm. And one of the favorite things that one of the honors students spoke about was the idea that we were wrong about calling it freedom. Because our society takes free as not meaning a whole lot. And so when students think something's free, it doesn't matter as much. And that's, I thought, there's probably a lot of truth in that, you know? I would also say when I teach the large class, I usually have a lot of international students in the class, and they know the First Amendment better than American students. And I think, again, not to blame public school teachers who are getting paid nothing and working very hard to begin with. But I think if we really want to care about the First Amendment, there has to be more of a discussion about it, what it means, what are the consequences. Because again, as was mentioned earlier, the First Amendment is about the government not restricting your language, right? So if you're, you know, if you're working for private industry, they can. There's consequences, and that's also important to let students know, right? There are consequences to these, and it might be worth it, but you have to understand that there's consequences from the beginning. Of course, what's going on right now is a little terrifying. I don't know how I'm going to teach in the spring the way I used to teach, because university professors at public schools, public school teachers, right, are being punished, suspended, losing their jobs, and that's nothing. And again, I teach history and I teach law. This is not typical, and I hate to use the word unprecedented because we use it now all the time. But I think it does mean we need to discuss what the First Amendment means more and more. Because maybe it's worth the consequences, but you need to know that there are consequences. And I think that's sometimes the hard part within that, right? What are these things and what they mean? And I'll finish up my concept of freedom of the press by saying, student journalists are the best. They don't care. It's amazing sometimes because student journalists go after administration and they can actually win more there than they can with athletics, by the way. Go after the football team. It's much harder actually than. But they're trying and they're working and they're doing it. And in a time where journalism is under attack a lot, I can't believe the number of applicants we have every semester. I can't believe how much they care about doing the right thing. And if there's any takeaway I can give you, again, the kids are okay. They care, it matters. And as long as we support them and support journalism overall, free speech still exists. Thank you.
Alrighty, so while questions are collected, I am going to go ahead and start with a few questions that I had listening, and feel free, whoever wants to answer, take the mic and begin. But I first want to start, and it was partially because I heard the word empathy when we were talking about free speech and cancel culture and stuff like that. And so I'd love to know your thoughts on any ethical responsibilities when it comes to the First Amendment and protecting free speech. What do you think those might be?
Could you define what you mean by ethical responsibility?
So I have both my personal thoughts and my professional thoughts. No, it's okay. I'm representing. But I know cancel culture. I think of cancel culture as a buzzword. I don't really fall into cancel culture. What I do think is accountability matters. And so are there any for those who are podcasters, journalists, for anyone who's picking up a camera to film and share their opinions, for folks, and I say podcasters because I think everyone now has a podcast and they're all debating and it's just like the thing to do right now. And so do they have any ethical responsibilities to the things that they're saying? And then for folks who are watching, what if you don't want to do cancel culture, but is there any accountability to be had?
Interesting question. First thing I want to say is that the First Amendment talks about Congress shall make no law that abridges, in this particular case, a free press. It doesn't say that that press has to be responsible or ethical. It doesn't say that the press has to be truthful. And at the beginning of our republic, if you ever go back and look at those early versions of newspapers, you would recognize them as rags. They were used to basically empower the owner of the press to say whatever he wanted. And often, a lot of the early duels, and I think including Aaron Burr's, all started from articles in the press. Somewhere after the yellow journalism of the 1920s, the press industry decided that it needed to pull up its pants and start putting ethics in, and we now have achieved an effort to kind of make journalism to be factual, to be fair as possible. Not always easy, because sometimes news is very fast moving and everyone who does it is a prisoner of their sources who's giving them information. But the fact of the matter is, I am very reluctant when it comes to free speech to get into notions of what responsibility is. Because you start to get into the question of, once you establish that, who's the referee? And I have friends of mine who, when you talked about sticks and stones, she would basically say that she felt that it was really important that we don't talk in hateful ways, and hate speech has to be dealt with, and we can't use words that offend people. But the fact of the matter is, words that offend people is very much like, for instance, the Education Commissioner's line for punishment was disgusting, disgusting text. disgusting is going to be very much who's looking at it. I hate horror movies. I think they're disgusting. My son loves them, you know? So the concept of disgust, that's called overly broad language. And that's why it's open to discretion, and that's why courts don't like it and they find it unconstitutional. So while as individuals and as professions, I do think they have responsibility, ethical responsibility. I think everyone needs to basically take responsibility for their words and their actions, not that everyone does. But I am very reluctant as a defender of the First Amendment to start getting in as seeing that as a requirement. Because once you start to make it as a requirement, you start to get into the issue of who's going to be the referee. Do you want Ron DeSantis to be the referee of speech? Do you want Pam Bondi to be the referee? I mean, they're doing that now as it is. Okay? One of the most heinous things I heard of in the area of free press is the Pentagon just last week saying that it was going to force journalists to sign a vow that they would only put out information that was pre-approved. It's propaganda. So my feeling is personally, and as someone who's an extremist when it comes to defending the First Amendment, look, as a former journalist, I like truth and I believe in it. But as someone who's very nervous about government overreach, if you want to talk crap and you want to talk lies and you don't have any scruples, go out in the public place, talk about it, keep it open. Last point I want to make before I hand off, when I was talking about cancel culture and kind of forcing viewpoints, something very important to remember. I covered the full breakup of the former Yugoslavia. And for 40 years, Tito dealt with nationalism by exiling, jailing, and executing people who spoke about nationalism. 11 years after his death, the country was torn apart in an orgy of nationalistic violence. Driving ideas and speech underground doesn't do anybody any favors. I would argue that it adds a mystique to it. So I don't have a problem with people lying, because I believe that an educated public has the ability to see through that, but at the same time, the need for free speech and to avoid government overreach, I'm not sure I'm individually in favor of.
That's a lot for one question.
All right, and I know that we have a little bit of a time limit and there are questions from the audience, so I do want to get to as many as possible. So we can start with this one. Since the First Amendment begins, Congress shall make no law. Could courts interpret this narrowly to follow infringement of First Amendment rights by everyone except Congress?
This was established by the Supreme Court more than 100 years ago, and has been reinforced time and time again. So, in fact, when it was decided, it was a 92-year-old precedent was overturned to say that basically Congress shall make no law means all government shall make no law. You can talk about it, the city commissioners in Oviedo. You can talk about county. You can talk about like the smallest town you can think of. That has stood now for well more than 100 years. So I don't think that's a real question at hand. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Supreme Court can do anything, right? But I haven't seen that being chipped away at as someone that teaches law. That's pretty well established. Again, when Supreme Court justices are questioned in front of Congress, no one asks that. So I'm hoping that's a good thing, But it's been well established. Yes, the Supreme Court for 92 years said Congress shall make no law was Congress. But states also had their own views of this. It was not that simple. Lots of states said you can't violate someone's essentially First Amendment rights, right? I mean, we talk about freedom of the press, and we talk about religion, and we talk about speech, but assembly is not as sexy, and petition, also not sexy, but they're still in state laws all over the country.
I find petition really hot.
Alrighty, perfect. Thank you for that answer. And then I do have two for you, Dr. Voss. And one of them is it a problem that UCF has no student paper?
They do have a student paper. My husband is the advisor.
Well,
Seriously, my husband's the advisor. When Gannett pulled out, the Nicholson School put it together. It's been there for at least, 8 years now. But yeah, my husband's their advisor. It's part of their capstone.
Is it independent?
Yeah, well, I mean, it matters how you define independent. No, I mean that in a serious sort of way. Gannett was the UCF newspaper for a long time. And Gannett gave them no money. They had no advertising person. Nicholson, so that is part of UCF, but we have signed numerous documents, and in these 8 years, I've never once heard of an administrator of any kind censoring or making a statement that mattered, ever. So I would call that independent. And again, I've been part of student newspapers for a very long time. It is very hard to find a student newspaper nowadays that doesn't have some connection to the university because of the money. I mean, but I will tell you this, I would call it independent because never, ever has an administrator, including times when they were very angry. I've heard that on the speakerphone. How angry administrators were. They never changed, they were not able to change a word. They weren't able to punish a student or the administrator.
I was at UF when we were banned from publishing abortion information. So we ended up hand stuffing them in. We printed them separately and we stuffed them into the papers. And we got all thrown off campus. And we ended up being, in those days, truly independent, but now, precisely because of money, it's back associated.
well, thank you both for that, and shout out to you guys for standing up. As a repro organizer, I'm pro do what you gotta do. And I would love to know, and I think also just because of what just happened, and I mentioned podcasts and stuff like that, we were all talking about, or everyone pretty much mentioned that you fight speech with more speech. And so do you all have advice or call to action? I think sometimes you can see that someone is very much set in their ways. And as much as you'd like to educate them, as much as you'd like them to see another side, they are committed to their beliefs, which is their, that's their sauce. So what advice would you give for folks in the room? Because I'm sure you all might have friends or family that you want them to see the light, and it's not working. And so would you say to just, kind of leave them where they are, or do you think that there is a way to kind of have them understand the other side?
Understand the issue better than they do, and ask them questions until they understand it better.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. Let me see. How much time do we have? Okay. I was gonna see if I could do one more, but
yes. One, maybe two more, depending on how fast.
Okay, so there's so many. Okay, so I'll do this one. Is all or any speech free? I understand that you cannot yell fire in a theater. Isn't some speech that stokes violence not protected?
The line is, so hate speech, speech you don't like, speech that could be racist, speech that could be inflammatory is usually protected. The lines that cross it is if it's a direct incitement to violence, and commanding people to do something that upsets public order, which would be like screaming fire, or something where you're demanding an imminent action which would cause harm. Those are the lines that are crossed. When you cross that, then that's no longer protected speech. The problem is increasingly people's tolerance levels to what, for instance, you had the Commissioner of Education talking about we're taking action because that's hate speech. You had Pam Bondi speaking recently that she's going to move against hate speech. To be a violation, to be a First Amendment violation or speech that's not protected, it has to cross the line. And the kinds of things that people are pointing to does not cross the line. Even though you may not like some speech, I mean, if someone, for example, people who don't like Charlie Kirk, they were talking about his hateful speech. And while it was, you know, for many reasons, people did see it rightfully as hateful, it was still protected speech. So it's got to be really something that, and also when it comes to incitement and violence, if I say Bobby Block should be killed, that's not a violation. But if you are standing in front of me and I'm next to you and you say, kill that guy, that then goes to the other level. So it's got to be an imminent threat and an imminent call to danger where it's no longer protected.
Can I just say this before we close? What I've heard as a common theme tonight is we're pretty ignorant when it comes to this. I think this room is probably less so than most spaces. But you talked about most people don't understand free speech. You talked about how students don't, or students do understand it, but there are certainly some gaps. You said they're okay, but they don't get free speech. And what I said was public employees, volunteers, they're not generally trained on that. So I think we need more education on this and less rhetoric, longer bumper stickers that actually get to a point instead of just stopping before people actually understand things.
I'm going to do a really quick plug here for the ACLU. And so if you all are in circles and spaces where you feel like there should be better education when it comes to the First Amendment, we do Know Your Rights trainings. And one of the Know Your Rights trainings that we do is on the First Amendment. We do it for protesting because the laws here in Florida when it comes to protesting are different than the rest of the nation, and a lot of people don't know that. And so if you are looking for education around this issue, I am more than happy to connect you with either myself or our First Amendment organizer who also does like trainings so that you all have the information and can give it to your friends, families, coworkers, everyone.
And if we're doing shameless plugs, we have a 24/7 hotline for people with issues that we will get you legal staff. We have a legal referral service, and we are right now launching a lawsuit against the state for the contracts for that were handed out for alligator Alcatraz. And we are presenting this year a reform bill to reform our public records laws, which once were a beacon to the entire nation, and now they're on life support because the governor and government agencies no longer have a desire to let you know what they're doing because they don't want you to know what they're doing. So come, go to floridafaf.org, donate, educate yourself, call our hotline.
I want to thank all of you. This was really so insightful. And just, you know, we talked a lot about civics education and people understanding, and, you know, the League has an entire series which we are now putting in at all of the local libraries over the next couple of months, all around the county. One on local government, on why your vote matters, on all of this basic civics education. So please encourage people to attend. And again, the League is a wonderful place for you to learn more, become more informed. I can't tell you how many people come up to me and say, well, you must know, and ask me some questions. So we also have our 50-50. And Katherine, I'm going to let you draw the lucky ticket. No pressure. Okay, here we go. 507-8188. 81. Hey, very nice. I'll bring it around. Thank you so much.
Yes.